Chapter 1. All Aboard the Albion. The year was 1887, and the steamship Albion stood proudly at the dock, her sleek hull gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The ship was a marvel of Victorian engineering, boasting elegant cabins, grand dining halls, and expansive decks that promised the finest in luxury travel. This voyage, a journey from London to the Mediterranean, was intended to be a retreat for the upper echelons of society, an escape from the dreariness of England's winter to the warmth of exotic shores. Detective Jane Parsons stood at the foot of the gangplank, her sharp eyes surveying the bustling scene. She was not here as a detective, at least not officially. This voyage was meant to be a holiday, a rare opportunity for rest after her latest exhausting case. Dressed in a finely tailored traveling suit, Jane was an unusual sight among the crowd of vacationers. Her presence commanded attention, not because of her appearance, though she was striking in her own way, with dark, intelligent eyes and a posture that exuded quiet confidence, but because of the aura of purpose that surrounded her. Unlike the other passengers, who laughed and chatted excitedly about the forthcoming voyage, Jane remained alert, her senses attuned to the subtleties of her surroundings. As she ascended the gangplank, she couldn't help but notice the diverse mix of passengers. There was Lord Henry Barrington, a distinguished gentleman in his late 50s, accompanied by his much younger wife, Lady Edith. The couple seemed mismatched, with Lord Barrington's stern demeanour contrasting sharply with Lady Edith's vivaciousness. Not far behind them was Miss Beatrice Langley, a wealthy spinster with a sharp tongue and a reputation for meddling in other people's affairs. Jane had read about her in the society pages, where Miss Langley's caustic wit was both admired and feared. Further down the deck, a group of young gentlemen, clearly from well-to-do families, were engaged in a lively discussion, their laughter echoing across the ship. Jane recognized one of them as Mr. Charles Whitmore, the son of a prominent industrialist. He was known for his charm and good looks, as well as his penchant for gambling and other vices. A few steps away, a nervous-looking man in his 30s caught Jane's eye. He was pacing back and forth, glancing anxiously at the ship's crew as they went about their tasks. His clothing, though of good quality, was slightly rumpled, and there was a distinct air of unease about him. As she reached the main deck, the ship's purser, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, greeted her with a polite bow. "Welcome aboard the Albion, madam. May I see your ticket?" he asked, extending a gloved hand. Jane handed him her ticket, watching as he inspected it with practiced efficiency. Satisfied, he returned it to her with a smile. "Your cabin is on the upper deck, near the stern. If there's anything you need during the voyage, please do not hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Jane replied, taking the ticket and nodding politely. She proceeded to her cabin, which she found to be spacious and elegantly furnished. The polished wood paneling, plush carpets, and large windows overlooking the sea all spoke of the luxury that the Albion promised. After placing her luggage neatly in the wardrobe, Jane took a moment to look out of the window, her thoughts drifting to the journey ahead. The ship's horn sounded, a deep, resonant note that reverberated through the air, signaling the imminent departure. Jane felt a slight thrill as the ship slowly pulled away from the dock, the distant skyline of London beginning to fade. The Albion was now a world unto itself, a floating microcosm of society where, for the next several weeks, its passengers would live, dine, and interact in close quarters. In such an environment, secrets had a way of surfacing, and Jane couldn't help but wonder what hidden stories might unfold during the voyage. The first evening aboard the ship was a lively affair. The passengers, eager to begin their holiday, gathered in the grand dining hall for a sumptuous dinner. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the room, illuminating the richly set tables, where guests indulged in fine wines and exquisite dishes. Jane observed the scene with interest, noting the various social dynamics at play. Lord and Lady Barrington sat together, though their conversation seemed strained, with Lord Barrington frequently glancing at his pocket watch as if anxious for the meal to end. Miss Langley, seated nearby, seemed to be paying more attention to her neighbours' conversations than to her own meal, her sharp eyes darting about as she eavesdropped on every word. Jane found herself seated with Mr. Whitmore and two other gentlemen she hadn't yet met. Mr. Whitmore, ever the charming host, engaged her in light conversation, though Jane could sense the superficiality behind his smooth words. The other two men, Mr. Arthur Hastings and Mr. Frederick Collins, were of a more serious disposition, discussing business and politics with an air of self-importance. Jane participated politely, but remained observant, her mind cataloguing every detail. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew more relaxed, with passengers mingling and enjoying the ship's many amenities. Some ventured to the ballroom for dancing, while others retired to the smoking room for brandy and cigars. Jane, however, opted for a quiet walk on the deck, seeking solitude under the starlit sky. The night was calm, the sea stretching out endlessly before her, a vast and mysterious expanse. The gentle sound of the waves lapping against the hull provided a soothing backdrop as Jane strolled along the deck. As she turned a corner, John noticed the nervous man from earlier leaning against the railing, his back to her. He was alone, staring out at the dark waters with a troubled expression. Jane hesitated, considering whether to approach him. Before she could decide, the man suddenly straightened up and hurried away, disappearing into the shadows of the ship's interior. Jane watched him go, her curiosity piqued. With a final glance at the calm sea, Jane decided to retire for the night. Chapter 2. An Unfortunate Discovery. The morning dawned bright and clear, and the Albion sailed smoothly, cutting through the waves with an effortless grace. The ship's passengers, rejuvenated by a good night's sleep, began to emerge from their cabins, eager to embrace the day's activities. The atmosphere aboard was one of light-heartedness and anticipation, with the promise of warm Mediterranean ports still days away. Detective Jane Parsons awoke early, and after dressing in a simple yet elegant morning gown, she stepped out onto the deck. The cool sea breeze was invigorating, and she took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment of peace. Jane had always found solace in the rhythm of the ocean, its vastness offering a reminder of how small individual troubles could seem in the grand scheme of things. The deck was already bustling with activity. Passengers strolled leisurely, some chatting animatedly, while others took in the view with serene smiles. A few energetic souls had engaged in an impromptu game of shuffleboard, their laughter carrying on the wind. Jane walked along the promenade, her eyes discreetly scanning the faces around her. She noted the absence of the nervous man from the previous evening, wondering where he might be and whether his anxiety had abated. As she made her way toward the stern, Jane encountered Miss Beatrice Langley, who was perched on a deck chair with a small notebook in hand. The older woman was scribbling furiously, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jane couldn't help but smile at the sight. Miss Langley's reputation as a gossip columnist was well known, and it seemed she was gathering material even on holiday. "Good morning, Miss Langley," Jane greeted her, pausing by the chair. Miss Langley looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized Jane. "Ah, Miss Parsons, good morning to you as well. Taking in the sea air, are we? Quite refreshing, isn't it?" "Indeed," Jane replied, her tone pleasant. "And how are you finding the voyage so far?" "Oh, it's all very fine," Miss Langley said, her tone dismissive. "Though I must admit it's been rather uneventful. I was hoping for a bit more excitement, something to spice up the social pages, you know. But so far, everyone seems on their best behavior." She glanced around as if hoping to catch someone in a scandalous act, then sighed. "Not much to write home about." Jane chuckled softly. "I suppose that's a good thing. A peaceful voyage is what most of us are hoping for." Miss Langley snorted. Perhaps, but peace is dreadfully dull, don't you think? Ah, well, there's still plenty of time for things to take an interesting turn. Bidding her farewell, Jane continued her walk, her thoughts returning to the passengers she had observed the previous day. She was particularly curious about the Barringtons, Lord Henry Barrington and his much younger wife, Lady Edith. The age difference between them was not uncommon among the upper classes, but Jane had sensed an underlying tension between the couple. Lord Barrington had seemed distant, almost cold, while Lady Edith appeared to be making an effort to remain cheerful, though her eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. As Jane approached the stern of the ship, she noticed a small gathering of passengers clustered near the railings, their faces marked with a mix of curiosity and concern. Frowning, Jane quickened her pace, her instincts flaring as she sensed something was wrong. The murmured voices of the passengers reached her ears, fragments of sentences that hinted at trouble. Simply ghastly. Never seen anything like it. What could have happened? Jane pushed her way through the crowd, her presence commanding attention. The passengers parted to allow her through, and she found herself facing the source of their distress. Lying on the deck, half hidden by the shadows cast by the ship's superstructure, was the still body of a man. The sight was jarring, even for someone as experienced as Jane. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. He was dressed in a gentleman's attire, though his clothing was dishevelled, the collar of his shirt torn as if in a struggle. A faint trace of blood stained his lips, and his hands were clenched tightly, as if he had died in agony. Kneeling beside the body, she conducted a quick examination, noting the man's lifeless state and the signs of a violent death. There was no doubt in her mind. This was no natural passing. The man had been murdered. "Who found him?" Jane asked, her voice steady. A young woman stepped forward, her face pale with shock. "I did, miss," she stammered. "I was taking a walk and I saw him lying here. I thought he might be asleep, but when I got closer, I realized. Oh, it's horrible." Jane nodded, her expression sympathetic. "You did the right thing by raising the alarm. What's your name?" "Emily, miss." "Emily Carter," the woman replied, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders, as if seeking comfort from the fabric. "Thank you, Emily. I'll take it from here. Please return to your cabin and try to rest." Emily nodded gratefully and hurried away. Jane stood up, her mind already racing as she considered the implications of what she had found. A murder aboard the Albion. It was the last thing anyone would have expected on a peaceful pleasure cruise. But now that it had happened, Jane knew she had to act swiftly. The ship was still several days from its next port of call, and the murderer was almost certainly still on board. The crowd of passengers had grown, their murmurs growing louder as speculation spread like wildfire. Jane knew she had to take control of the situation before panic set in. She turned to the ship's purser, who had arrived on the scene, his face pale with shock. "Mr. Dawson, I believe it's essential that we secure this area and keep the passengers calm. We must also inform the captain immediately." The purser, clearly rattled, nodded. "Of course, Miss Parsons. I'll see to it at once." He gestured to a couple of crew members, who quickly moved to cordon off the area and gently usher the onlookers away. As the crowd dispersed, Jane took a closer look at the victim. His features were vaguely familiar, and it didn't take long for her to place him. He was the nervous man she had observed the previous evening, the one who had seemed so troubled, so out of place among the carefree vacationers. Jane felt a pang of regret. She had sensed his distress, but hadn't acted on it. Now it was too late. Before long, Captain James Meredith arrived, his normally composed demeanour strained with the gravity of the situation. The captain was a seasoned sailor, with a reputation for maintaining order and discipline aboard his ship, but even he seemed shaken by the discovery of a murder on his watch. "Miss Parsons," Captain Meredith greeted her, his voice grave, "I was informed that you've taken charge of the situation. I must say, I'm grateful to have someone of your experience aboard, though I wish it were under different circumstances." Jane inclined her head. Thank you, Captain. We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation, but I believe it's crucial that we keep this incident as discreet as possible. We don't want to incite panic among the passengers. Agreed, the captain said, his jaw tightening. I'll see to it that the crew maintains order. Have you identified the victim? Not yet, Jane admitted, glancing at the body. But I do recognize him from last night. He seemed troubled. Perhaps someone in his acquaintance might be able to shed light on his identity and the circumstances leading up to this. I'll have the ship's doctor examine the body to determine the cause of death, Captain Meredith said. In the meantime, I'll assist you in any way I can. The safety of my passengers is my utmost priority. As the doctor arrived and began his examination of the body, Jane turned her attention to the task at hand. The ship was vast, and with so many passengers, the list of potential suspects was daunting. But Jane had learned long ago to trust her instincts. The key to solving this case would lie in understanding the victim's final hours, who he had interacted with, what had caused his distress, and why someone had wanted him dead. Her first step was to question the passengers who had been on deck that morning, particularly those who had gathered around the body. Someone might have seen or heard something unusual, even if they didn't realize it at the time. Jane also planned to investigate the victim's cabin, hoping to find clues that would reveal his identity and perhaps even point to a motive. The peaceful holiday voyage had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse, and Jane knew that every decision she made from this point forward would be crucial. The murderer had claimed one victim already, and she was determined that there would be no more. Chapter 3. The Three Suspects. The ship's doctor, Dr. Edward Carrington, completed his initial examination of the body, his expression grim as he approached Detective Jane Parsons, who was standing a few feet away, deep in thought. "Well, Miss Parsons," Dr. Carrington began, his voice low, "there's no doubt about it. The man was murdered. Poisoned, most likely, though we'll need to conduct a more thorough examination to determine the exact substance." Jane nodded, having suspected as much. "Poison," she repeated softly, the word echoing ominously in her mind. Poison was a favored weapon of the cunning, a method that required planning and precision. It also hinted at a certain intimacy, as the murderer had to be close enough to administer the deadly dose. But who on this ship had both the opportunity and the motive to commit such a crime? "We'll need to identify the victim as soon as possible," Jane said. "There's likely a passenger list. Can you have someone bring it to me?" "Of course," the doctor replied, "and I'll perform a full autopsy once we reach port, but in the meantime, I'll do what I can aboard the ship. I'll also have the body moved to the infirmary and kept under guard until we know more." As Dr. Carrington left to make the necessary arrangements, Jane turned her attention to the next critical step: identifying the man and uncovering his story. Within the hour, the purser, Mr. Dawson, returned with the passenger list. He handed it to Jane, his expression still tinged with worry. "Here it is, Miss Parsons," he said. "I've also taken the liberty of assigning a couple of crew members to assist you with anything you might need." "Much appreciated, Mr. Dawson," Jane replied as she took the list. She quickly scanned the names, searching for any that might match the man's appearance, or that she had observed him interacting with. Her eyes landed on a name that seemed to fit: Mr. Albert Fielding, a man traveling alone, listed as a merchant. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. Jane knew that to solve this murder, she needed to construct a timeline of Mr. Fielding's last hours and determine who had been in close contact with him. It was likely that someone on board had known him, or at the very least had seen him acting out of the ordinary. To begin with, she needed to question those who might have crossed paths with him during the voyage. She decided to start with the three individuals who had already caught her attention: Lord Henry Barrington, Lady Edith Barrington, and Mr. Charles Whitmore. Lady Edith Barrington. Jane began with Lady Edith, whom she found in the ship's reading room. The room was elegantly appointed, with plush armchairs and a large window that offered a panoramic view of the ocean. Lady Edith was seated near the window, a book in her hands, though her eyes were distant, as if her thoughts were far from the page. "Lady Barrington, may I have a word?" Jane asked gently as she approached. Lady Edith looked up, startled, then quickly composed herself. "Miss Parsons, of course, please join me," she said, gesturing to the chair beside her. Jane sat down, taking a moment to observe the young woman more closely. Lady Edith was beautiful, with delicate features and golden hair, but there was a weariness in her eyes, a shadow that hinted at unhappiness. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Lady Barrington, but I'm conducting an investigation into the unfortunate incident that occurred this morning," Jane began. "I'm hoping you might be able to help me with some information." Lady Edith's expression grew guarded. "I heard about the man's death," she said quietly. "It's terrible, truly, but I'm not sure how I can be of help. I didn't know the gentleman." "His name was Albert Fielding," Jane said, watching Lady Edith closely for any reaction. "He was traveling alone, and it seems he was poisoned." Lady Edith's eyes widened and she paled visibly. "Poisoned? How dreadful! But I assure you, I have no knowledge of Mr. Fielding or how he might have come to such a fate." Jane nodded, sensing the woman's fear was genuine, but also recognizing the possibility that Lady Edith might be withholding something. "I believe you," she said, her tone reassuring. "But even the smallest detail could be helpful. Did you perhaps see him in passing, or notice anything unusual in the last day or so?" Lady Edith hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the book in her lap. Well, I did see him last night, she admitted, but only briefly in the dining hall. He was seated alone, looking rather anxious. I remember feeling sorry for him, but I didn't approach him. After dinner, I returned to my cabin early. I was feeling unwell. Jane didn't press further, sensing that Lady Edith was struggling with something personal, unrelated to the murder. "Thank you, Lady Barrington," she said, standing. "If you think of anything else, please don't hesitate to come to me." "I will," Lady Edith promised, though her voice lacked conviction. "Lord Henry Barrington." Jane found Lord Henry Barrington on the promenade deck, pacing slowly with his hands clasped behind his back. His tall, rigid frame and stern features gave him an air of authority, but Jane detected a certain tension in his movements, as though he were carrying a heavy burden. "Lord Barrington, may I speak with you?" Jane asked, falling into step beside him. He glanced at her, his expression neutral. "Miss Parsons, I presume. What can I do for you?" "I'm investigating the death of Mr. Albert Fielding," Jane said directly. "I'm hoping to gather information about his interactions with the other passengers, and I wondered if you might have noticed anything unusual." "Fielding?" Lord Barrington repeated, frowning slightly as he seemed to search his memory. "The name is familiar, but I can't say I knew the man personally. I believe I saw him at dinner last night, though I didn't speak with him." Jane nodded. "Did you notice anything unusual about his behaviour?" Lord Barrington paused, his brow furrowing as he considered her question. "Nothing that struck me as out of the ordinary," he replied after a moment. "He appeared rather nervous, I suppose, but that's hardly uncommon on a ship. Some people aren't accustomed to the sea." "True," Jane agreed, though she sensed there was more to Mr. Fielding's anxiety than just seasickness. "Did you happen to see anyone approach him?" Lord Barrington shook his head. "No, I didn't see anyone approach him, but then again, I wasn't paying close attention. My focus was elsewhere." He seemed to want to leave it at that, but Jane's probing gaze prompted him to elaborate. "I've been preoccupied with business matters," he admitted, his tone clipped. "This voyage was supposed to be a reprieve, but I found it difficult to leave my concerns behind." "Thank you, Lord Barrington," she said. "If you recall anything that might be of assistance, please let me know." "Of course," he replied curtly, resuming his pacing as Jane departed. "Mr. Charles Whitmore." The final person Jane sought out was Mr. Charles Whitmore, who was found in the smoking lounge with a few other gentlemen engaged in a game of cards. The room was filled with the rich scent of tobacco, and the atmosphere was one of casual camaraderie. "Mr. Whitmore," Jane called, catching his attention as he laid down a winning hand. He looked up, flashing her a winning smile. "Miss Parsons, what a pleasant surprise," he said, rising from his seat. "To what do I owe the honour?" Jane didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I'm investigating the death of Mr. Albert Fielding," she said, her tone serious. "I'm sure you've heard about it by now." Whitmore's expression sobered instantly. "Yes, I did hear. Terrible business, that. But I'm afraid I don't know the fellow. I can't recall ever speaking with him." Jane studied him carefully. "You didn't notice him at dinner last night? Or perhaps in the lounge afterward?" Whitmore frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall. "I was in the dining hall, yes, but I was preoccupied with my own affairs. I might have seen him, but I can't say for certain. After dinner, I spent most of the evening here, with the chaps. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary." Jane wasn't entirely convinced by his nonchalance, but she knew better than to press too hard. Whitmore was a social butterfly, and if anyone had seen or heard something of interest, it would likely come to him through the ship's grapevine. "If you do happen to hear anything, please let me know," Jane said, holding his gaze. "Of course, Miss Parsons," Whitmore replied. "If I come across any useful gossip, you'll be the first to know." As the day wore on and the Albion continued its journey across the sea, Jane returned to her cabin. She considered the possibility that Mr. Fielding might have been involved in something clandestine. His nervousness suggested he feared someone or something, but what? And why would someone go to the lengths of poisoning him? There were too many. Chapter 4. The Hidden Motive. The following morning, Jane made her way to the ship's dining room for breakfast. The room was already bustling with activity. The clinking of silverware and soft murmur of conversation filled the air, but there was an undercurrent of unease that Jane couldn't ignore. She noticed that the three suspects, Lady Edith Barrington, Lord Henry Barrington, and Mr. Charles Whitmore, were all present. Lady Edith was with her husband, her delicate features strained with what Jane suspected was forced composure. Lord Henry looked as though his mind was far from the breakfast in front of him. Mr. Whitmore, as always, was surrounded by a small group of passengers, regaling them with tales of his past exploits. She took a seat at a table near the back of the room, where she could observe the others without drawing too much attention to herself. Mr. Dawson, the purser, approached her table. His usually calm demeanor was tinged with anxiety. "Miss Parsons," Mr. Dawson began in a low voice, "I hate to disturb you, but there's been a development that I think you should be aware of." Jane set down her teacup and looked up at him, her curiosity piqued. "A letter, Miss Parsons," he said, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "One of the stewards found it this morning, slipped under the door to the purser's office. It's addressed to you." He handed her a small, neatly folded piece of paper. The envelope was unmarked, but the note inside was written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. She unfolded it carefully and began to read. "Miss Parsons, you are closer to the truth than you realize. Mr. Fielding's death was no accident, and if you continue to pry, you may find yourself in grave danger. There are forces at work here that you cannot understand, and it would be wise to abandon your investigation before it's too late. Consider this your only warning. There was no signature, no indication of who might have penned the note, but the message was clear. Someone on board was desperate to keep the truth hidden." Jane folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. As she watched Mr. Dawson walk away, she couldn't help but wonder who among the passengers, or crew, was trying to intimidate her. Jane realized now that Mr. Fielding's presence on the ship was no coincidence, and Jane was certain that whatever had brought him aboard the Albion was directly linked to his murder. Jane finished her breakfast quickly and made her way to the purser's office. "Mr. Dawson," Jane said as she entered, "I'd like to take a look at Mr. Fielding's cabin, if possible. There may be something there that could shed light on his death." "Of course, Miss Parsons," Mr. Dawson replied, standing up. "I'll accompany you. His cabin is in the first-class section just down the corridor." When they reached the cabin, Mr. Dawson unlocked the door and stepped aside to allow Jane to enter first. The room was tastefully decorated, with rich mahogany furniture and a large window that offered a stunning view of the sea. The bed was neatly made, and the cabin appeared undisturbed. She began by examining the desk, where a few personal items were arranged neatly. There were several letters, written in the same hand as the note she had received, but they offered little insight into Mr. Fielding's life, beyond the mundane details of his business dealings. However, one letter, in particular, caught her attention. It was written in a different hand, the script elegant and refined, and it seemed to be more personal in nature. Jane carefully unfolded the letter and read it. "Dearest Albert, I cannot begin to express how much I miss you. This voyage seems endless without your company, and I long for the day when we can be reunited. Please, take care of yourself and return to me safely. There is so much I need to tell you, so many things that weigh on my heart. Yours always, E." Jane's mind raced as she considered the implications of the letter. E could be Edith, Lady Barrington, though the letter lacked any other identifying details. But if Lady Edith was the author, it suggested a personal relationship with Mr. Fielding, one that might explain her anxiety and the tension between her and her husband. But it was also possible that E was someone else entirely, someone Jane was determined to find out. She carefully refolded the letter and placed it in her pocket alongside the warning note. Her search continued, but the rest of the cabin yielded nothing of significance. Mr. Fielding's personal belongings were sparse, and there was no indication that he had been involved in anything illicit or suspicious. As she made her way back to the main deck, her attention was abruptly drawn to a figure emerging from a nearby cabin. It was Lord Henry Barrington, his face drawn and pale. He didn't seem to notice her as he hurried down the corridor, his steps quick and deliberate. She watched him go, her suspicions growing. Lord Barrington's behaviour was becoming increasingly erratic, and she wondered if his apparent preoccupation with business was a cover for something more sinister. Determined to find out, Jane followed Lord Barrington at a discreet distance. He led her to the ship's smoking lounge, where he took a seat in a secluded corner. Jane chose a spot nearby, where she could observe him without being noticed. She watched as he ordered a drink and lit a cigar, his hands trembling slightly. As he sat there, she noticed another passenger enter the lounge, Mr. Charles Whitmore. Unlike the confident and affable man Jane had seen earlier, Whitmore's demeanour was now subdued, almost wary. He glanced around the room before making his way over to Lord Barrington's table. The two men exchanged a few words, their conversation too quiet for Jane to overhear. But she could see the tension between them, the way Lord Barrington's jaw tightened, and Whitmore's gaze darted nervously around the room. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear that it was not a friendly chat. After a few minutes, Whitmore rose from the table, his expression troubled. He left the lounge without another word, leaving Lord Barrington to brood alone. Jane knew she had to find out what the two men had discussed, but she would have to be careful. Her next step was to confront Lady Edith. The letter suggested a close relationship between her and Mr. Fielding, and Jane needed to confirm her suspicions. But she also knew that Lady Edith might be hiding more than just an affair. If she had known about the murder, or worse, been involved in it, then confronting her could be dangerous. Chapter 5. Clues beneath the surface. As the Albion sliced through the blue waters of the ocean, its passengers tried to reclaim the sense of leisure and tranquility that a luxury cruise should offer. Despite the undercurrent of unease triggered by the previous day's grim discovery, life aboard tried to return to normal. Deck games resumed, afternoon teas were laid out with customary elegance, and the soothing melodies of a string quartet drifted from the salon. But for Jane, the ship had transformed into a complex crime scene weaving through the waves. After her encounter with Mr. Dawson and the unsettling message left for her, Jane knew that her investigation had stirred deeper waters than she'd first imagined. She decided to confront Lady Edith Barrington directly about the letter she found in Mr. Fielding's cabin. However, an unexpected obstacle presented itself. Lady Edith had retreated to her cabin, reportedly suffering from a severe headache, and requesting no visitors. Next, Jane made her way to the lower decks, where the crew's quarters and the galley were located. The staff often observed much more than they were given credit for, and their insights could prove invaluable. In the galley, Jane found the head chef, a burly man named Mr. Thompson, overseeing the preparation of the evening's dinner. She introduced herself, explaining that she was conducting an inquiry into Mr. Fielding's death and wondering if he had noticed anything unusual among the guests or other crew members. Mr. Thompson wiped his hands on his apron, his expression turning thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, miss, there was something odd the other night," he began, lowering his voice. "It was after dinner, clean-up was nearly done, and I saw Mr. Fielding speaking with one of the stewards. It looked serious, and they seemed to be arguing about something." Jane listened intently, her mind cataloguing every detail. "Do you know which steward it was?" "I'm not sure of his name, but he's one of the new hires, tall, with dark hair. He seemed upset, even scared after the talk." Thanking Mr. Thompson, Jane left the galley and headed to the steward's quarters. She found the man described by Mr. Thompson, who reluctantly identified himself as Thomas. After some persuasion, he admitted to meeting Mr. Fielding, who had accused him of misplacing some of his personal items, including documents he claimed were vital for his business. The argument had gotten quite heated, but Thomas swore it was only verbal, and that he had seen Mr. Fielding alive long after their confrontation. With this new information, Jane returned to the main deck to visit Dr. Carrington, hoping he had completed his preliminary autopsy of Mr. Fielding. "Miss Parsons, I've completed my examination," Dr. Carrington announced. "It's definitive that Mr. Fielding died of poisoning as suspected. The substance, however, is somewhat unusual. It's not commonly found aboard ships, and seems to have been administered in his evening drink." "Could anyone have accessed such a substance?" Jane inquired, her mind racing through the possibilities. "It's not something we keep on board for medical purposes," Dr. Carrington explained. "Whoever administered it must have brought it with them. It's a rare and fast-acting poison, hard to detect, and leaves the body quickly." The poison's rarity meant that the list of suspects could potentially be narrowed down to those who could have had access to such a substance before boarding the ship. As Jane pondered her next steps, a young woman approached her on the deck. She introduced herself as Clara, a maid who had been servicing the cabins on the first-class deck. Clara was hesitant at first, but then divulged that she had seen Mr. Whitmore visiting Mr. Fielding's cabin on more than one occasion, and once she had overheard parts of a heated conversation about some investment gone wrong. The connection between Mr. Whitmore and Mr. Fielding, coupled with the mysterious arguments and the rare poison, suggested a motive rooted in financial dealings. Perhaps a deal that had soured, leading to desperation. She prepared to delve deeper into the financial angle, planning to access the ship's communications logs to see if any messages sent or received by Mr. Fielding could shed more light on the matter. Chapter 6. Stormy Revelations. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a somber mood settled over the Albion. The skies darkened earlier than expected, clouds rolling in from the west, heavy with the promise of a storm. The ship's crew hurried to secure loose items on deck, and as the wind picked up, the previously calm seas began to churn, reflecting the growing turmoil both within and outside the ship. Jane knew that time was of the essence, and decided to confront one of her key suspects before the storm fully unleashed its fury. She found Mr. Charles Whitmore in the lounge, a room now devoid of its usual lively chatter. He was staring out at the increasingly violent waves, a glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. Jane approached him, her presence commanding yet calm. "Mr. Whitmore, may I have a word with you in private?" she asked, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Whitmore turned, his face showing a mix of surprise and resignation. He nodded silently, leading her to a small alcove away from any lingering passengers. "Mr. Whitmore, I've learned that you had several interactions with Mr. Fielding before his untimely death, some of which were quite heated," Jane began, watching his reactions closely. Whitmore sighed, setting his drink down. "Yes, I did know Fielding. We were involved in a business venture together, but it went south. I lost a substantial amount of money. And yes, we had disagreements, but I assure you I did not kill him." Jane observed him carefully. "Were you aware that Mr. Fielding was poisoned with a rare substance, one not typically found aboard a ship?" Whitmore's eyes widened slightly, betraying a flicker of panic. I had no idea. Poison? That's monstrous." "Indeed," Jane replied softly, "and your financial disputes would certainly provide a motive for murder." Whitmore ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely distressed. "I swear, Miss Parsons, my dealings with Fielding, while unfortunate, would never drive me to murder. I'm a businessman, not a killer." Jane considered his words, noting his distress. It was possible that he was telling the truth, or he was a very skilled liar. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Whitmore. I do hope for your sake that what you've told me is the truth. Leaving Whitmore to his troubled thoughts, she decided to check on another suspect before the night was over, Lady Edith Barrington, whose mysterious connection to Mr. Fielding had deepened the intrigue. Lady Edith's revelation. Navigating through the corridors, now echoing with the sounds of the storm, Jane made her way to Lady Edith's cabin. After a brief conversation with the steward, she was granted entry. Inside, Lady Edith sat by a small writing desk, a look of distress visible upon her face. Lady Edith, I found a letter in Mr. Fielding's cabin, signed with an E. Jane said without preamble. I need to know if it was from you. Lady Edith's face paled, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Yes, it was from me, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Albert and we knew each other from a long time ago. Our paths crossed again unexpectedly on this voyage. The letter was nothing more than a farewell, I assure you. Jane studied her, sensing the truth in her words, but also detecting layers of unspoken sorrow. Was your husband aware of your past with Mr. Fielding? No, he was not, Lady Edith replied, her eyes filling with tears. And now I fear that my silence may have contributed to this horrible situation. Jane comforted Lady Edith, promising discretion for now. As she left the cabin, the ship lurched violently, a stark reminder of the brewing storm outside. As Jane returned to her own cabin, her mind raced with the day's revelations. The storm outside raged unabated, a fitting backdrop to the chaos of her investigation. Chapter 7. The Misleading Motives. The storm had passed by the early hours of the morning, leaving behind a calm sea and a clear sky, the tumult of the night seeming almost like a distant memory. Jane rose early, and as she prepared for the day, she reviewed her notes meticulously. The suspect's motives were tangled, and her interactions from the previous day had provided both clarity and further confusion. Today, she needed to sift through the misleading motives and uncover which were genuine and which might be mere facade. She decided to start her day by visiting the captain to discuss the latest developments. Captain Meredith welcomed her into his quarters with a grave expression, indicative of his growing concern over the safety and order on his ship. Miss Parsons, I trust your investigation is making progress, he inquired, gesturing for her to sit. Yes, Captain, though it is a complex web we are untangling, Jane replied, settling into the chair across from him. Each suspect has plausible reasons for their behavior, yet I believe we are closing in on the truth. I hope so, Captain Meredith said, his tone earnest. This voyage was meant to be a retreat from the world's troubles, not a cause for more. Jane nodded in agreement and excused herself, feeling the urgency of resolving the case more acutely. Her first stop was Mr. Whitmore's suite. The previous night's conversation had left her with doubts about his involvement, and she needed to clarify his financial dealings with Mr. Fielding further. Mr. Whitmore received her in his suite, a luxurious space that contrasted sharply with his current troubled demeanor. I've been thinking about our last conversation, Jane began, about the failed investment and your financial disputes with Mr. Fielding. Can you provide more detail about these transactions? Whitmore sighed, passing a hand over his face. It was a business venture in the Indies, spices and textiles. I invested heavily based on Fielding's assurances, but the returns were disastrous, and much of my investment evaporated. Jane listened intently, probing deeper. And on the night of Mr. Fielding's death, where were you? I was here in my suite, Whitmore responded quickly, almost too quickly. Jane noted this, but also noted his willingness to cooperate. I can ask my steward. He brought me documents to review that evening. Jane noted this alibi for verification and thanked Mr. Whitmore for his time. Next, she sought to clarify the nature of Lady Edith's relationship with Mr. Fielding. If jealousy or fear of exposure was a motive for murder, Jane needed to understand the depth of their connection. Lady Edith was more composed today, though still visibly shaken by the events unfolding around her. "Lady Edith, about your relationship with Mr. Fielding," Jane began, as they sat in the lounge, a quiet corner providing them some privacy. "You mentioned it was a past connection. How did it come to be rekindled aboard this ship?" Lady Edith took a deep breath before responding. "It was purely by chance. We recognized each other and reminisced about old times. There was no rekindling of anything, Detective. It was just a closure of sorts." Jane sensed the sincerity in her words, but also the omission of deeper emotions, possibly at play. "And your husband, Lord Barrington, was he aware of any of this?" "No, and I intended to keep it that way. Albert understood that, and we agreed to part ways again after the voyage," Lady Edith explained, her voice laced with regret. Her final revisit was to Lord Barrington. Jane found him in his usual spot on the deck, looking out over the sea. "Lord Barrington," she addressed him with a respectful nod, "may I inquire about your activities on the evening of Mr. Fielding's death?" Lord Barrington turned, his gaze sharp. "I was in my study, dealing with some urgent business communications. Why do you ask?" "I am trying to ascertain everyone's whereabouts," Jane explained, "and if you were aware of any connection between your wife and Mr. Fielding." The question seemed to catch him off guard, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I was not aware of any such thing. Is this relevant?" "Potentially," Jane replied noncommittally, observing his reaction closely. As the day drew to a close, Jane reflected on her findings. The motives of jealousy, financial loss, and hidden relationships had all surfaced, yet none conclusively pointed to the murderer. Tomorrow, she would delve into verifying alibis and cross-referencing statements, hoping to catch a break in the case. Chapter 8. A Dance of Deception. Today, the ship's social calendar promised a diversion, a grand masquerade ball to be held in the evening. It was an event that promised glamour and gaiety, but for Detective Jane Parsons, it presented a perfect opportunity to observe her suspects in a social setting, possibly lowering their guards under the guise of festivity. As the day progressed, the atmosphere aboard the ship shifted. Excitement buzzed in the air. Elaborate costumes and mysterious masks were the topics of conversation, temporarily overshadowing the undercurrent of tension. Jane used the daytime hours to follow up on the alibis provided by her main suspects. She confirmed Mr. Whitmore's alibi with his steward, who verified delivering documents to him on the night of Mr. Fielding's death. This verification, while clearing some suspicion from Whitmore, did not entirely exonerate him, as the steward could not confirm his whereabouts for the entire night. She also spent time in the ship's communication room, reviewing telegrams and ship-to-shore messages that might shed light on any clandestine communications. However, nothing substantial came to light. As evening fell, the grand ballroom on the Albion was transformed into a scene from a Venetian carnival. Opulent decorations, vibrant colors, and the shimmer of masks created an otherworldly ambiance. The ball commenced with the ship's orchestra playing a lively waltz. Jane observed as Mr. Whitmore, now in a devilishly charming pirate costume, mingled effortlessly among the guests. His mask of joviality seemed a bit too perfect, a performance honed by a man accustomed to social deception. Lord and Lady Barrington, dressed in royal finery, reminiscent of a bygone era, kept mostly to themselves, the strain in their marriage subtly evident even beneath their regal masks. As the evening progressed, Jane circulated through the crowd, her gaze sharp behind her mask. She noted the interactions, the body language, and the exchanges that might seem inconsequential to an ordinary observer. Her focus sharpened when she spotted a heated exchange between Mr. Whitmore and a mysterious figure dressed in a raven mask. The conversation seemed tense, and although the music and laughter around them masked their words, the body language was telling. Later that evening, as she stood observing the night sky, a figure approached her. It was the man in the raven mask. Without a word, he handed her a folded note and quickly disappeared back into the crowd. Jane opened the note cautiously. "Meet me at the stern deck at midnight. There is something you need to see." Puzzled and intrigued, Jane prepared herself for another encounter that might finally bring some clarity to the murky waters of her investigation. As the ship's clock struck midnight, she made her way discreetly to the stern deck. The area was deserted, the sounds of celebration from the ballroom distant. The man in the raven mask was already there, his figure silhouetted against the moonlit sea. "Thank you for coming, Detective Parsons," the man said, removing his mask. It was Thomas, the steward she had questioned earlier about his argument with Mr. Fielding. "I didn't know who else to trust," Thomas confessed, his voice tense. "I overheard something critical last night, after the storm. Mr. Whitmore met with someone I didn't recognize. They talked about a deal gone wrong with Mr. Fielding and mentioned something about ensuring silence permanently." Jane listened intently. "Did you see who he was talking to?" "No, but I caught a glimpse of this," Thomas said, handing her a unique cufflink he had found near the site of their conversation. It was distinctive, ornate with an embedded emerald, likely part of a custom set. "Thank you, Thomas. This is very helpful." She needed to confront Mr. Whitmore again, this time with the new evidence and information. Chapter 9. The Unexpected Murderer. As the night waned into the early hours of the morning, the masquerade ball concluded, leaving behind a trail of confetti and the echo of laughter in the now silent ballroom. Jane Parsons, however, had little time to reflect on the festivities. Armed with the new information from Thomas and the incriminating cufflink, she was ready to confront the reality of deceit woven into the fabric of the Albion's seemingly jovial journey. Jane requested an urgent meeting with Mr. Charles Whitmore. She found him in his suite, a look of weariness shadowing his features, perhaps from the night's revelries, or, as Jane suspected, from the burdens of his guilty conscience. "Mr. Whitmore, we need to talk," Jane began, her tone more assertive than before. "I have reason to believe that your involvement with Mr. Fielding was far more complicated and sinister than you previously admitted." Whitmore's attempt to maintain his composed demeanor faltered as he saw the cufflink in Jane's hand. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic betraying his polished facade. "That looks like one of my cufflinks," he stammered, trying to regain his composure. "How did you get that? I lost it some time ago." Interestingly, it was found near the site of a very enlightening conversation about ensuring Mr. Fielding's permanent silence, Jane countered, watching his reactions closely. Whitmore sank into a chair, the weight of his secrets unraveling. "All right," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't kill Fielding, but I can't deny that I wanted him out of the way. He was blackmailing me. After our investment failed, he discovered some irregularities in my handling of the funds. He threatened to expose me unless I paid him a substantial sum." "So, you plan to silence him permanently?" Jane pressed, seeking clarity. "No, I couldn't bring myself to do it. We argued and I threatened him, but I didn't poison him. I swear it." Whitmore's voice was laced with desperation. Jane considered his words carefully. Whitmore had motive and opportunity, but his admission and the fear evident in his expression suggested another possibility, that he was perhaps being framed. With Whitmore's new revelations, Jane revisited her notes and the list of suspects. Another encounter the previous evening played back in her mind, the tense discussion between Lady Edith and her husband, Lord Barrington. Recalling the strain in their interactions and Lady Edith's own secretive past with Fielding, Jane decided it was time to confront the couple together. She found Lord and Lady Barrington in their cabin, the air thick with unspoken words. "Lord Barrington, Lady Edith, I must ask you both about your whereabouts and actions on the night of Mr. Fielding's death," Jane stated. Lord Barrington's stoic demeanour cracked, a sigh escaping his lips. Detective, I know more than I have let on. I discovered Edith's letter to Fielding and the truth of their past connection, he confessed, his voice heavy with remorse. And what did you do upon learning this? Jane inquired, her gaze shifting between the couple. I confronted Fielding, Lord Barrington admitted. I was furious, threatened him, but I did not kill him. I couldn't. But someone did, using a poison rare and hard to trace, Jane added, piecing the puzzle together. A poison that a person of your experience and resources could potentially obtain. Lord Barrington paled, his eyes widening in shock. No, I didn't. It wasn't him, Lady Edith interjected, her voice breaking. It was me. Jane turned to Lady Edith, her suspicions aligning as the pieces fell into place. Go on, she prompted gently. I couldn't bear the blackmail, the threat to our reputation, to Henry's reputation. I found the poison in a market during a previous voyage, kept it, just in case, Lady Edith explained, tears streaming down her face. I never intended to use it, but when I saw no other way to protect our lives from scandal, I added it to Albert's drink that night. The confession was a stark revelation, not just of the murderer, but of the desperation and lengths to which individuals would go to protect their loved ones and their lives from ruin. As the Albion sailed towards its destination, so too did the case resolve, though the resolution was tinged with sadness and loss. Lady Edith was taken into custody, her fate to be determined upon their arrival. Lord Barrington, stricken with grief and guilt over his role in the tragic events, remained isolated in his cabin. Jane reported the outcome to Captain Meredith, who was gravely disappointed but relieved that the mystery was resolved. Chapter 10. Justice on the Waves. The final day aboard the Albion dawned sombre and reflective as the ship approached its destination. The events of the past few days had cast a long shadow over the passengers and crew, leaving an indelible mark on what was meant to be a journey of leisure and escape. For Detective Jane Parsons, the resolution of the case brought little satisfaction. The cost of justice had proven high, with the unraveling of lives and the exposure of deep-seated vulnerabilities. She stood on the deck early in the morning, watching the coastline slowly emerge on the horizon. She thought about Lady Edith Barrington, now a prisoner in her own right, confined to her cabin under guard until they reached port. As the passengers began to emerge on deck, their conversations were subdued. The news of Lady Edith's confession had spread, and while there was relief that the murderer had been identified, there was also a palpable sense of sorrow for the Barringtons. The tragedy had touched everyone in some way, a reminder of the fragility of human connections. Captain Meredith requested Jane's presence in his office later that morning. As she entered, she found him looking out his window at the approaching shore, his posture reflecting the weight of the voyage's unexpected events. Detective Parsons, he began, turning to face her, I cannot thank you enough for your dedication to resolving this unfortunate matter. Your work has undoubtedly saved us from further distress and the reputation of our company. Jane nodded, accepting his gratitude. Thank you, Captain. It was my duty to help ensure the safety and security of everyone on board. I've arranged for the local authorities to meet us upon landing to take Lady Edith into custody and to handle the formalities, the captain continued. Your assistance with the transition would be appreciated. Of course, Captain. I'll do whatever is necessary, she replied. As the ship docked, Jane assisted in the preparations for disembarking. The local police were efficient, boarding the ship as soon as it was secured to take Lady Edith into their custody. Jane watched as Lady Edith was escorted off the ship, her expression one of resigned acceptance. Lord Barrington accompanied her to the gangway, his support unwavering despite the circumstances. Their final goodbye was a private moment, filled with words unsaid but clearly felt. After the authorities had departed with Lady Edith, Jane took a moment to speak with some of the crew members she had interacted with during the investigation. Their respect for her work was evident, and their relief palpable. Thomas, in particular, thanked her for her trust in him, acknowledging that her belief in his testimony had been crucial. I'm just glad I could help bring some peace to the ship, Thomas said, shaking her hand. And I'm grateful for your courage, Jane responded, knowing the risks he had taken by coming forward. As Jane prepared to disembark herself, she took one last look at the ship, and as it faded into the background, Detective Parsons looked forward to her next case, wherever and whenever it might call her to serve.